classic history examples from data visualization. Think of something like John Snow, the father of epidemiology. There's the pub named after him in Soho. He famously was dealing with a cholera outbreak in Soho, and no one knew where it was coming from. No one knew that it could travel in the water. And he made a map, and he drew on a dot map the address of everyone with cholera in Soho, and it became clear that they were clustered around this well on Broadway Street that had a handle. So he famously went down with his spanner and took the handle off, and thereby ended the cholera outbreak. So it's another just example of how sometimes the trends seem obvious, but it's actually only when you visualize it that you can see what's going on.
This is Duncan Clark, co-founder and CEO of Flourish and head of Europe at Canva. Now, today we've got a slightly different theme to the Lives of Tomorrow podcast. We're talking about how numbers in a spreadsheet can be used to create amazing stories, and how all the data that's been tracked about our lives can be transformed to envisage important and interesting stories about our lives and our futures. So, to help make sense of the art of data storytelling, I'm delighted to welcome Duncan Clark, co-founder and CEO of Flourish, a data visualization studio, and head of Europe at the rapidly growing design platform Canva. Duncan's an author and previously worked as a data journalist. I'm Carla Buzasi, CEO of WGSN, the world's leading trend forecasting company, and you're listening to Lives of Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast about how we'll live our lives in the future. Duncan, a big welcome to the podcast. Let's start with you introducing yourself to our listeners.
Hi, my name's Duncan Clark. I head up Canva in Europe and EMEA, and I joined as the co-founder and CEO of Flourish, the data storytelling platform.
Amazing. Now, probably most people have heard of Canva, but just in case anyone hasn't, can you give us a kind of idiot's guide?
So Canva is a design platform that set out about 10 years ago to empower the world to design, to try and democratize visual communication in all its many forms, to allow people to design anything on any platform, on any device, in any language, with any ingredient. And we've grown over that period to around 240 million active users every month. So we've become quite an important part of the design ecosystem.
But I think what's quite unique about it is I'm definitely a words person rather than a kind of visual person. It's, it has democratized it. It's really easy to use. And I guess that's, that hopefully lasting legacy, but has changed the way maybe people think about design.
That's right. I mean, if you go back, take the really big picture view, then, go back a couple of centuries, everything was just black and white text, and that very few people could actually produce that text. And over time, the world became more and more visual, with the rise of graphic design, with pop art, with all these different technologies that enabled us to produce visual content. And that took us up to, say, the desktop publishing revolution. But even then, by the turn of the millennium, you still had tools that meant that only a very small people were really empowered to visually communicate, because they were expensive, and they were difficult to use, and they required a lot of training. And what we've seen in the last couple of decades is Canva growing in rise in parallel with the rise of social media and the world becoming even more visual. And those two things together have really driven a visual revolution.
Now, this is definitely not my first question at all. It's definitely not the one I've got written down to ask you, but I sort of feel like I can't end this part of the conversation without talking about how AI is changing visual imagery. I was on, I can't remember which particular, maybe Google Slides, and got a prompt the other day that now Gemini will create images for me while I'm putting, decks and things together. What's your take on that?
So, I mean, maybe to set the scene, so Canva's always been setting out to empower everyone to design, and using whatever technology is available at the time to help with that, whether it's kind of collaborative editing in the cloud computer era, or whether it's just, what the web started to become able to do as we had proper web apps 10 years ago. And so for us, AI is just another tool that empowers this mission. And we have been into this for a long time. We acquired Remove BG, the visual AI company Kaleido, about 4 years ago. And even before LLMs were cool. And then as LLMs became more dominant, we've incorporated those deeply into Canva. We have our own models. We also use off-the-shelf ones. We've just crossed 18 billion uses of our AI features in Canva.
Wow.
So,
my God.
which, if you think there's only, fewer than 8 billion people in the world, it's quite crazy. And that could be anything from translating a a document or a design or a presentation in one click into multiple languages, or it could be about generating an image, or it could be a workflow thing like take my social post and reformat it into 8 different platforms for different aspect ratios. So what we're seeing is, yes, there's a lot of generative AI going on with people quickly getting that first step of design a bit further. And in a way, Canva's always been into that because we've always been a template-based system, and this is just another way to get you to that starting point. But what we're really seeing is that the people who are using AI in design and marketing and comms most effectively are actually the people who are seeing it as a workflow tool rather than just as a creative, generative tool. Because actually, there's always the need for the human editing layer. And what we're seeing is ever more users designing and being involved in design as AI makes everything easier. So it's actually more people rather than fewer. And people sometimes ask me, do you think with AI, fewer people are designing? And if you look at our usage stats, which are still growing up exponentially,
Yeah.
it's obviously not the case.
Not the case at all. Okay, right. Now I'm going to talk to you about what I'd asked, what we dragged you here today to discuss, which is more about data. And we have lots of people who listen to this podcast who don't work in future gazing forecasting, which is obviously my background and where WGSN is coming at this kind of story from. But we live in a big data world. Our data is being gathered all the time. Even probably this conversation, in some shape or form, all of our data is being logged and stored somewhere. But it has now, through organizations like your own, but also individuals like you, we now have a world where data can become stories, and it can become very, very visual. So why don't we start? Can you give me an example of a data set that has then become a story?
I mean, I'm a journalist by background. So for me, I always think, what's the data behind that story when I see it in the news? And I think every major news story in the world has a data set behind it normally, whether it's a freedom of information request or whether it's a set of recordings of the rollout of COVID vaccines globally. So, I mean, all the stories that we think about, all the things that happen in the world, actually they almost all contain structured information, which we would call data. And if I just think of all the visualizations that I worked on on a bespoke basis as a journalist, and before we launched Flourish, I think of things like, for example, when we took all the world's recorded information of commercial ships, and so it's a billion recordings of just lat, long, and timestamp. But then if you stream those into the browser and you play them over time and you interpolate between the codes of the ships, what comes to life is this amazing image of the global economy with different types of ships moving in these kind of invisible dual carriageways around the ocean. And so suddenly something like that, you have this very dry data, and actually it's very interpretable and very meaningful, and actually in a very visceral way, just by bringing it to life really visually.
What was it that drew you to this as a career?
Well, I got into journalism by being very interested in climate change and energy. That had become a bit of a pet topic of mine. I was a book publisher originally and an author, and I found myself thinking the audience is where the journalism happens, not where the books happen. And so I joined the Guardian as they were setting out to make a strategic priority of climate change over the next 5 years, and with quite an interesting brief to do innovative, different sorts of journalism, whether that was giving more context than, for example, giving just news headlines, or whether that was giving data, which obviously overlaps with context. And so that was my way into. I mean, I'd always been interested in visual communication, and that was my way into data storytelling.
Okay. So your work now, a lot of that is about helping individuals or companies explain and create data visualizations. And there's always going to be a story with it. Well, I'm presuming there's always a story within that. So, we kind of start, middle, and end. What are the benefits of utilizing that kind of methodology to tell these stories?
Well, fundamentally, humans are very motivated by stories and engaged by stories. So, in a sense, all the communication we do is a form of storytelling. And inside if you think in a business context, for example, then what is a presentation? You can divide it up in different ways, but it's a linear narrative with a beginning and a middle and an end. And so I just think it's useful to sort of think of it that way, to remind yourself that you are actually a storyteller, whether you've thought of it that way or not. and to craft your narrative in a way that your audience will actually respond to it. And I guess what we pioneered at Flourish was that idea that actually data is part of the storytelling, and that rather than having a bunch of charts dotted into a presentation, what you could actually do is really bring data to life with animation and interaction, and with tracking data over time and seeing it as an integral ingredient to that storytelling rather than just an input at the beginning of the process.
And do you at the moment, do people sort of come with I'm not getting my point across, and we think that you are the people to help us do that? Or is it people come and go, well, I need some data visualization in this deck? What are people sort of at the level of adoption and passion about it as you are, or do you still feel you're persuading people this is the best way to tell stories?
So I think it's very much the former in as far as people come to Flourish. We've got a very inbound model. So we don't go out and try and persuade people that they need Flourish. Instead, we explain what Flourish is, and people tend to come to us, and someone in the company has worked out that they have a sort of data storytelling problem. And increasingly, I think as the different disciplines sort of merge, it used to be that you'd have a data scientist with a dashboard over there, and you'd have a sort of business analyst with a Word document over there, but what we've done at Canva, and Flourish was acquired by Canva about 4 years ago, is really try and break down those silos. And so Canva, by its nature, is a highly integrated platform where you can make a presentation that might halfway through become a whiteboard, or maybe suddenly we've just launched Canva Sheets to help people work with data more easily. But a sheet isn't a separate tool. It can just be a page, or it could be a table. Like, you
Yeah.
think we get used to these weird things like, you make a doc and it has a
Yeah.
table in it, but then you can't put a formula in it. And
Yeah.
why? Because we're all stuck in this sort of anachronistic world of file formats where, it's a .doc format, therefore there's no formulas. It's just,
Yeah.
it's really historic and really weird when you come to think of it.
Well, also, you think of it that way, it's like, well, that's the finance team's kind of way of doing things.
Exactly.
That's that's the wordsmiths or the journalists or the, editors or something like that. Yeah, and when you put it that way, it is kind of bonkers that that's why it's set
It
up.
is kind of bonkers. And I think what we're seeing, especially with sort of as the new generation get a bit more senior in the workplace, is that they instinctively don't work like that. They've grown up with tools like Canva. They haven't really grown up with downloaded software that
Yeah.
they've kind of that they keep for specific tasks. I mean, my daughter does all her homework on Canva, and even before we had Canva Docs, she was using Prezos because she just liked the interface to make her
Ah.
documents. So I think a lot of that generation, they've got a much more developed instinct for what good
Yeah.
user experience looks like,
Yeah.
and they're quite uncompromising in going after
Well, I was
that.
going to say, because they're used to the best kind of interfaces because they've grown up on social media, which do
Exactly.
one thing and, have armies of engineers to ensure that it is really user friendly, and therefore that expectation is across everything. I mean, even, when we're trying to use the TV and, it even sort of interfaces on televisions today still seem quite backwards given the
100%.
advancements in technology. This should be really intuitive. Why am I having to press these 5 buttons to get to the guide for what's on TV?
Yeah.
That's just a personal pain point. Give me a great example of a brand that you think has utilized this art form to illustrate something and kind of had a really powerful outcome.
Well, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a cop out to the question, but I think in a way, every business that is successful is winning at this, because all business decisions these days are data driven. And in fact, all business activities generate new data. So it's this two-way thing. And there are very few businesses left who aren't really floating on a sea of data. And I mean, what they all have in common, those who've become particularly good at it, is, I mean, firstly, appointing really good data teams, like having a really good head of data, really good data science capability, just changes not only the sort of the interpretation capacity, but it also allows you just to move faster, to innovate faster, to try different tools. And just like a startup, data is always evolving, the technology,
Yeah.
and so sort of moving with the times and trying to be really dynamic is really helpful. But also increasingly what we're seeing is that companies have realized now there's so much data that the challenge is actually not making another dashboard about X.
No.
It's focusing on the key points that are hidden in that data, and then bringing those to life in a way that is sufficiently engaging that people take notice of it.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to get into a world where you silo your data team, you end up with hundreds of dashboards that are self-serve in theory, but actually no one looks at them. And in fact, what we're all drawn to is stories. That's why, social media is so
Yeah.
addictive.
Yeah.
And so thinking of data as a form of storytelling. But I guess the other thing is that in businesses, the metrics are often private, right? And so, often it's quite difficult to talk about exactly what happened in a particular business. I was mentioning COVID before. If you take a more public example, you think about how John Byrne Murdoch, the brilliant visualization lead at the Financial Times, you think of his very viral charts tracking COVID rates in different countries. And he did that thing of aligning them all so they start when the outbreak happened rather than just having a x-axis that's a time series, and actually being able to really pull out some interesting insights and then directly inform how we deal with this sort of mega uh, global issue. But there are so many examples, classic history examples from data visualization. Think of something like John Snow, the father of epidemiology. There's the pub named after him in Soho. He famously was dealing with a cholera outbreak in Soho, and no one knew where it was coming from. No one knew that it could travel in the water. And he made a map, and he drew on a dot map the address of everyone with cholera in Soho, and it became clear that they were clustered around this well on Broadway Street that had
Oh,
a
wow. I
handle.
didn't
So
know that.
he famously went down with his spanner and took the handle off, and thereby ended the cholera outbreak. So it's another just example of how sometimes the trends seem obvious, but it's actually only when you visualize it that you can see what's
That
going
you
on.
can see it. My God, that's what I want to see that now. I mean, I've drunk in that pub many times.
Right. Okay. Well, now you know who it's named after.
That's my only connection to that story at the moment. I feel like a bit stupid, but there you go. We're going to pause a minute, and I'm going to ask you some quick fire questions to try and get to know you a little better, and then we will come back to the topic in hand. So, first thing that comes into your mind: you breathe life into data. What breathes life into you?
I would say curiosity, people, and ideas.
Do you use data in your personal life? And if yes, how do you use it?
I do. I think we all use data in our personal lives, whether we even realize it or not. Currently, I'm knee deep in a big house renovation, and I'm obsessing around all the data to do with that, around thermal efficiency and air source heat pump flows and all those kind of data sets.
What data about you do you gladly share, and what do you keep close?
It's a good question. I'm quite instinctively private as a person, so I guess I keep sort of personal data a bit closer to my chest. But I think anything where someone is genuinely interested and curious, I'm always inclined to share, because I sort of have that same curiosity itch, and I want to be able to scratch theirs as well as mine.
Yeah, have that two-way conversation. Are you someone who presses no to all the cookies on every website you go to?
No, I often mean to, and then just press the button that's furthest forward to get me to the actual content part. So that's one of the craziest rules in the world, the EU cookie legislation.
I know, painful. What's the best book you've read this year so far?
I am halfway through The Marriage Portrait at the moment, which is Maggie O'Farrell book.
I
set
love
in
Maggie
Florence.
O'Farrell. I
She's
love
amazing.
Maggie O'Farrell. I read literally everything that woman writes.
Have you read Marriage Portrait?
So this is when I was thinking, like, have I read that one? And I'm trying to remember whether I have. And yes, I have done.
Okay.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. What was the last thing that made you angry?
That's a good question. I mean, generally, I'm a very tolerant person. I don't get super angry, with the exception of when people are cruel to other people.
Okay, we're gonna try and be a bit more positive, and look to the future again. What about, so storytelling is a lot about human emotions, and I think people think of data as something that is devoid of emotion. So how do you sort of bridge that gap? And is the bridging of the gap that you are using it to create stories, or do you think emotions can be explained and tracked through this methodology as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I remember a conference talk I saw once called "A Data Point Walks into a Bar" that was kind of like exploring this topic. And And I guess one thing I would say is that very often a data set is a collection of records, each of which is an individual story. So,
Mm.
you might have a map. I remember seeing a map made in Flourish by Amnesty International, and it was a map of events that had happened in a particular country. I think it was Sudan. And, these were all really tragic incidents. There were bombs, there were shootings, there were kind of acts of terrible violence. And you look at the map, and of course, that is, it's showing you the geographic trends. That in itself isn't very emotive and certainly doesn't capture the depth of what's happened and isn't necessarily trying to. But one of the things, depending on what you're trying to achieve, that you can do with interaction is you can see those marks into as an entry point in something else. So, that one was made such that if you hovered over the dots, you could actually watch the video of the news footage about the event. And suddenly you have this thing that pulls together the geographic trends, the concentration that makes you realize how many of these things there are,
Yeah.
but also the individual stories inside that data
Mm.
set, which are, I guess, ultimately the most kind of, that's where the importance really lies.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, albeit a fairly kind of somber one. But where do you? Okay, so this is we're always looking to the future when we have these conversations. How do you see this evolving? Is it something that is going to be grasped by more individuals? Are we kind of are we just everyone understands this now? What's your prediction for the future?
Well, I think my main prediction is that if you think of, say, what Canva did when it set out 10 years ago, or maybe 11 years ago now, it set out to take a really important universal concept and
Hmm.
democratize it to make it possible for anyone to work with it. And so as we've launched Flourish, and then as we've started incorporating a lot of the Flourish ideas into Canva as well, that's what we have in mind. And I think that's the mega trend, especially with AI. It should be possible for anyone to really quickly and easily make sense of data and to bring it to life. And again, that's partly about probably AI powered
Hmm.
interpretation, but it's also just about workflow stuff. We just launched a feature in Canva where you could connect to a data source, like let's say you're a marketer and you use Google Analytics. People spend so much time going and screenshotting charts and then coming back and they're pasting them into their May marketing report. And then in June, they go back and they make it. And it's just so messy. It's just a massive waste of time. So now you can set that up once and then you can press refresh when it's June and it just refreshes. So sort of starting to break down the silos between the workflow tools, starting to have AI powered sort of democratization and making everything easier, quicker, and more insightful.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, a lot of the brands that we work with at WGSN have huge amounts of data themselves, huge, huge, huge amounts of data themselves, but are sort of so overwhelmed with that tsunami of numbers, don't really know what to do with it at the end. And I think where we've been very successful is the kind of, well, the so what, and how are you going to utilize all of this information? And it sort of sounds like the way we come at it and the way you come at it, they're quite different, but ultimately it's for the same outcome. That this is going to be something that's easy to understand and action as a consequence. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I guess with any technology, if you think of how it evolves over time, ease of action is generally like a core part of how things develop. Because once something is shown to be useful and relevant in the world, then it tends to just reach more and more people.
Yeah.
And as it reaches more people, it has to become easier and quicker. And if you think of what I was talking about at the beginning around desktop publishing, giving way to tools like Canva, they're all part of that same mega trend, I think, of democratization, ease of access, speed of use.
Yeah. I have been guilty of saying this before, but I'm going to say it again. I also think as human beings, we have gotten lazier. And some of that probably is the expectation that things just should be easy at the moment. But that sort of just get me to the bullet point, get me to the conclusion. I don't want to be the person who has to trawl through all of this information. And I think therefore they're delivering the so what, whether that
Mm.
is so you can really see it now and therefore it's easy to understand, or just delivering the right now go and do X because we've done all of that crunching beforehand. So less now about how the world of data visualization is going to evolve. What do you think about the data that we have now that can tell us about the future? So, what have you seen or heard or visualized that tells us something interesting about how the world's going to evolve?
Well, I guess the obvious answer for me, I spent about 10 years working on climate change, and that's such an interesting area to work with in data because, the data is quite clear, but it comes with big error bars. And so you're faced with that challenge of how do you visualize something complicated for an audience, many of whom won't be alive when the effects kick in, where both the responsibility and the effects are globally distributed among 7 to 8 billion people. And where there's significant error bars. We don't know exactly how sensitive the climate is to CO2. We don't know what the future CO2 emissions will look like. We don't know what the price reduction on solar energy will look like over time. So there's no area that's richer, more uncertain, but also more pivotal about thinking into the future.
For your industry, and actually for us as consumers, do you think we are going to get to a stage where so much more will be visualized now rather than, and again, I think social media does play into this a little bit, and we have become more aesthetically driven. Am I going to open my newspaper? God, how old do I sound there? Am I going to log on to my news website? And is the world going to be more visual? Are we going to understand stories through visualization more in the future?
Yes, I absolutely think we will. Obviously, Flourish is now used by newsrooms all over the world. And so, probably every day you will see a Flourish chart in a news article somewhere. But it still strikes me that very often you open a news article and what you're reading is 500 words describing some data. And it's so inefficient. It's what, Edward Tufte, one of the fathers of data visualization, talks about sort of data density and like how much information you're getting across with each pen stroke. And a simple chart that shows like a stock price over time or whatever gives you not only the current situation in the context of the last week, but if it's interactive, the ability to compare it with a previous era. You can annotate it. You can tell the whole story in a chart so much more effectively often than in several hundred words of text. It takes so much longer to read, and when you finish it, you still don't have that visual memory that you have with a graphic. So yeah, I think that's already happening. Think of the early days of Google, it only returned text summaries, and now, very often you'll put something into Google and you'll get a visual response. I know that's something that people there continue to think, how much more visual could it get? But also it's, we see it across the user base of Canva, which, we've added 150 million active users every month in the last couple of years. We're now at 1 in 5 internet users in certain countries use Canva every month. And what we're seeing is more and more users spread across different parts of companies. So it used to be more marketers, but now everyone is realizing that they're a visual communicator. So, it might be an HR team and they're trying to engage all the people at work, but they've realized that if they just send an email, then no one's going to read it. So they also have the same challenge that journalists have, that social media influencers have, that marketers have. Similarly for salespeople, they're pitching to their audience, which is their prospects. But, they've got the same fundamental challenge. Can you engage an audience? And everyone is realizing that works better if it's highly visual.
I'm literally sitting here thinking about my next board meeting. I think you may get a
Excellent.
call after this. Like, how can I get
Perfect.
my
Yeah,
point
let's chat.
across? How can I do that better rather than, because at the moment a board pack is loads of words and loads of Excel files, basically.
Yeah. So it's interesting actually when we launched, we, as I was saying before, like, moving beyond this era of the file format and like this idea that a doc format does a particular thing and a .xlr does something else. So we launched actually April at Canva Create the idea of multi-format designs, we call them. And the idea is you could have your board pack. It's starting to sound like a pitch
No,
now,
it's
which
fine.
wasn't my
We
intention.
might have to
But the
edit this
board
out,
pack,
but keep going.
yeah, the board pack could be, 3 or 4 slides to give the context and the timing of the meeting. Then it might be a scrollable document,
Yeah.
which would be all the detailed kind of pre-read. Then you might have a whiteboard, which is where you're going to do some brainstorming. And then maybe there's a couple of sheets with data. And that's all one, what traditionally would be called one
Yeah.
document. We call it a design. But there's just no reason they should be in different tools. There's no reason they should be in different folders. And there's definitely no reason they should be in different
Yeah.
files. And so yeah, combining and thinking of like where the people are is like projects.
Yeah.
Like your board meeting is a project. Whereas where the technology traditionally been is tools. And that's just, that's putting the cart before the horse, and it's something we're trying to fix at Canva.
But I think there's also and I'm very aware we're going to run out of time, but there is that I've used a few examples and things that have stuck in my head for years and years and years because it was visualized. And what you want out of any interaction, I would say, it mainly in the business sense, maybe not the personal, but people go away and remember the key pieces of information. And it's very difficult to remember a key piece of information if it was in row 60, line whatever, page 532, or that it was, the 132nd word in the 4th paragraph or something like that. But something that sticks in your mind, that will be so much more impactful. Anyway, I'm convincing myself here.
You're completely right. And also, I mean, it's partly about pulling out the key relevant stats and making them memorable. Like, what's the comparator? What's the way of expressing it that is memorable? But it's also where visuals have a huge effect, because our visual memory is just very measurably many tens of thousands of times better than our text memory.
Yeah.
There was a study from Harvard that came up with the number 60,000. Of course, it's one of those stats that, in a way, it's a bit meaningless, but it gives you the idea that if you look at our capacity to just take in information that you could, if you boiled it down to how many bits it would take to store, we can just store visual information much better. Like, we can hold maybe, the numbers are incredibly small when you think of how many words or numbers we can hold in our memory. Like, it's hard to hold more than about 10 numbers if someone just tells them to you.
Well, I still couldn't tell you my husband's mobile number. I just can't.
Right.
He's told it me a million times. We do feel like maybe it would be good that I could recall that. Still can't. I can remember mine, and I could still tell you my home phone number from when I grew up. Can't remember my husband's mobile number.
But I wonder if that's partly because when you were a kid, you used to have to dial it. And when you have to dial it, you actually create a visual pattern. I have a very clear visual memory of my phone number as a kid and the shape on the phone.
Yeah.
And in fact, I remember the shapes, not the numbers, really.
This has been so interesting. I feel like I could talk for you for another hour, and I'm definitely going to talk to you offline about how you can help me bring some of the things that we do to life better. But thank you so much for your time. It's been brilliant. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. It's been lovely to chat. Thanks for having me on.
A huge thank you to Duncan Clark, co-founder and CEO of Flourish and head of Europe at Canva. Please check out our other podcast, Create Tomorrow, with my colleague Cassandra Napoli. But that's all from me for now. I'll return with a new episode of Lives of Tomorrow in 14 days' time. My name's Carla Buzasi. I'm the CEO of WGSN, and I'll see you next time.